come from a long line of women on my mother's side in my family who were abusive to their children. And I experienced that also as a child from my mother. A lot of emotional abuse, certainly, but also physical. And when I looked back on my family's history, my mother was much less abusive than her mother was to her. And my grandmother was much less abusive than her aunt was to her. So there was this receding level of violence through our family, but it was still very much there. And then I noticed within myself certain tendencies toward violence. And it was never physical. I never felt like I ever wanted to physically hurt someone. But if I felt hurt by something or frustrated, and in particular it was a kind of helplessness, if I was in a situation where I felt like I couldn't do anything to make a difference to it, the intensity of anger and frustration would be so big in me that the only way I could get relief would be to like throw a phone across the room and smash it, or smash something, or take some kind of violent action to just relieve myself from the intensity of that feeling. I remember seeing my mother, and this was when I was an adult, with her second husband, having an argument in the kitchen. And she picks up a kitchen knife and she slaps him across the face with it. And what I noticed in my experience with my mother is that there were many things that she did where she worked so hard for herself to also break that pattern of violence. She didn't want to be an abuser. She worked so hard to provide a nurturing family. She would cook. She didn't work for the first part of our life so she could raise us. But when her experience of humiliation or shame or betrayal was triggered, she had no other recourse but to act out, it seemed. They were the moments where she would act out violently. And so I started to reflect on those experiences. And you know, it's hard to define, because when I was a kid, you know, smacking your kids was, in Australia anyway, was the norm. And I even see on Facebook and social media today about like, it's okay to hit your kids. You know, kids just need a good smack on the bum to teach them where boundaries are. So, you know, when you're looking historically at what line does it actually move from being what was considered normal discipline to actual abuse. And so my experience of my childhood was that it was abusive, and it wasn't just on a physical level, but very much so emotionally. When I was in my late 20s, my sister, who had also been in and out of abusive relationships, died when she was 23. And she always oscillated between either hurting herself or being in relationship with somebody that would hurt her. I remember one time I tried to assist her to leave a relationship that was really unhealthy and dangerous for her. And I took her out of her home and put her into a new home with her child, and she rented it. And she found it virtually impossible to stay out of that relationship. She kept needing something from him and kept calling him back to her, and then ultimately moved back in to the house where she was living. And as she struggled in her life with drugs and dysfunctional relationships and violence, when she was 23, she died and left behind 2 young kids. And as I came to terms with that for myself, I really started to ask the question of myself, what is it going to take for me to interrupt that pattern of violence that has perpetuated through my family for generations? The impact for me of her death in terms of my thinking about my impact on her was that I believed that she left not really knowing how much I loved her, because I was always judging her behaviors. And that was so profound for me, and I swore at her funeral that no other person would leave the planet not knowing how much I love them. I think as I got older, I noticed myself having huge aggressive reactions to things. And where it really showed up for me in my life was in my first marriage. It wasn't a physically violent relationship, but it was absolutely emotionally violent. So there was something when we met that we connected on a sense of something familiar between us, almost like a shared experience. And we found very early on in the relationship these similar patterns of violence in terms of picking fights with each other, or saying things with the intention to hurt one another, or withdrawing from communication when the other was trying really hard. Finding each other's buttons and knowing where to push them in order to instigate some kind of act of aggression. And that became so embedded in our relationship that we didn't actually know that there was anything wrong with that. That was normal for us. That's what we experienced as children. For my sister, I think hers was this really deep sense of loneliness that she couldn't be with. And whenever she felt lonely, she felt empty. And whenever she felt empty, she wanted to hurt so she could feel again. So she would cut herself, or she would overeat and then make herself throw up. Or she would be in a relationship that was either sexually violent or physically violent, and certainly emotionally violent. And so when she died, I made a commitment to myself to figure this out. And that meant that I had to deal with my own coldness, my own defense mechanisms, my own judgmental nature. I had to connect to my vulnerability, the part of me that was so terrified of being hurt, that had learned to protect itself through so much abuse. And so then I had to systematically unravel all of these defense mechanisms, which kind of sounds counterintuitive, but I had to unravel all these mechanisms to find out how I could deal with hurt more healthily, how I could deal with betrayal more healthily, how I could deal with fear, and find almost like a safe place within myself. So that then if those kinds of things happen, because they do, sometimes people leave you, some people lie to you, some people cheat, some people do things that hurt. But when confronted with those experiences, how was I going to respond that was going to be healthy, that was going to be good for them and good for me, and set healthy boundaries? And I had to learn that whole spectrum of things. I didn't know how to speak up without being scared of being hit or getting hurt somehow. I didn't have my voice around that. I didn't know how to set healthy boundaries. I was always trying to please everybody because I didn't want to upset anyone, because if I upset someone, I'd get hit. So it had so permeated its way into my life and into my psyche and how I dealt in relationships with people that I had to basically pull all of that apart. So I knew then that the key for me was to figure out how to learn other coping mechanisms around these intense emotions. And I think Brené Brown has done a lot of work around this idea of vulnerability. And in many cultures around the world, whether we're men or we're women, we're taught not to be vulnerable. We're taught to protect ourselves. We're taught to close our hearts off so that we don't get hurt. And vulnerability is also particularly seen as a sign of weakness as well. I had to learn how to find other ways to deal with the level of intensity in which I would feel certain things like hurt or betrayal myself, which were my particular sore points. And that was a really, really tough process for me. And I remember I had left my husband and I was laying in bed one day and I'd had a new relationship. And for some reason, I felt like I wanted to message my partner at the time and tell him, I think we should take a break. And then I thought about that and I'm like, why do I think we should take a break? And it was for no reason. I just had the impulse to do it. And so I started listening to myself and really looking at what was that going to give me? What was it going to feel like if I took the action? So instead of taking the action, I watched myself wanting to take it. And I felt this intense, searing pain of hurt through my body. I could feel it across my chest, through my arms, my fingers were tingling as I engaged with the impact of that and the hurt that that would cause me and the hurt that that would cause him. And as I was sitting with the intensity of all of this feeling in my body, what I realized was like, wow, this is the most alive my body feels. This is the most intense sensory experience I have. So maybe there's some need in me to hurt or to cause hurt so that I can hurt, so I can feel this alive. And so then I started this investigation about, well, what else can I do that's healthy, that still gives me that alive feeling? And so then I really started to explore that for myself. So thank you for listening to my story. It was a real challenge for me to share myself in that way. Transcendent Media Capital are about to launch its web series called Voices, where we're collecting stories from all over the world about people's experiences of domestic violence. So we want to hear from you, whether you're a recovered abuser, a survivor of violence as a child or intimate partner, or whether you work in the area as a researcher, a counsellor, a law enforcer, a psychologist, or for an NGO. We want to hear your stories. And we're aware that for some where they've had an experience of violence, safety can be an issue. So we've given a few formats. You can share your story as a piece of film, as an audio-only recording, as a written story, or a piece of artwork. And where safety really feels a challenge for you, you can change your name, that's okay. Any of the information we collect from you, any of your personal data will be kept strictly confidential because safety is our priority. But we also recognize that in the healing process, sharing can be very therapeutic and very freeing. So we encourage you to share. So if you click on the link below, we will take you to our video tutorial, which will walk you through the process of how to upload your stories to us at www.transcendent-media.com. And your stories will be reviewed and may have the opportunity to be aired on our web series Voices, which is coming out really soon. So with your story, try and share about your experience and try and share about your ideas about what it is that you think will make a difference to this issue globally and help people free themselves.